Hello and welcome to this, the third of 4 video lectures about the human value of progress. It is called Cultural Good Fortune and explores the question, why did breakthrough progress happen in the West? Because of the geographical luck discussed in the first video lecture on the human value of progress, it was a two-horse race to break through social development. China had been in the lead for 1,000 years, but was overtaken dramatically around 1800. Perhaps the question posed should be, why did China not win the two-horse race to break through progress? The fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century meant China took the lead in social development for 1,000 years. By the early 15th century, China had gunpowder, guns, printing presses, but hardly used them, navigation, and more. Chinese treasure fleets of around 250 junks, some twice the size of contemporary European warships, visited India, Arabia, and East Africa. Then the voyages stopped. Why stop the treasure fleet voyages? Well, the world already wanted China's goods, for example, silks, porcelain, so China didn't really need new customers. And after visiting countries around the Indian Ocean, the Chinese concluded that there was nobody else with anything that they needed or wanted. And voyages were expensive. Resources were needed to fight the Mongols in the north. The treasure fleet voyages stopped because the emperor had other priorities. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's 4 little Portuguese caravels entered the Indian Ocean. What if they'd run into a Chinese fleet? For the West to rise, the East had to make way, at least initially. In The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, the author describes the situation of the West and China in 1500. He describes China as an Oriental empire suffering from the consequences of having centralized authority which insisted upon a uniformity of belief and practice, not only in official state religion but also in such areas as commercial activities and weapons development. The lack of any such supreme authority in Europe and the warlike rivalries amongst its various kingdoms and city-states stimulated a constant search for military improvements which interacted fruitfully with the newer technological and commercial advances that were also being thrown up in this competitive entrepreneurial environment. Possessing fewer obstacles to change, European societies entered into a constantly upward spiral of economic growth and enhanced military effectiveness, which, over time, was to carry them ahead of all other regions of the globe. An absolute ruler at the head of a collectivist culture can make absolute errors. In China, there was a single source of power. Everyone followed the emperor's decision. Note that the West used to be the same. Centralized, monocultural, single power center, Rome, harassed by barbarians. The Roman Empire, over 1,000 years before, had been exactly the same as the Chinese Empire in the year 1500. But the collapse of the Roman Empire led to the Dark Ages in Europe and 1,000 years of fall and stagnation, but also to the development of decentralized diversity and dynamism. What if geography had favored Africa or India, or the Americas had been settled earlier? Because the Chinese what if is not the only what if in history. There are many what ifs in history. But surely some agricultural civilization would have invented the technologies at some time or other. And all agricultural civilizations expand the same way: conquest, colonialism, and slavery. It's what we call imperialism, or the creation of empires. But after all the what-ifs have been debated, we are left with the white ghosts, also known as white devils, also known as round eyes, as the first global imperialists. If the global imperialists had been other than European whites, the insults would have been different words, but the sentiment the same. If it had not been European whites who led the first wave of globalization, but another agricultural civilization, no doubt they too would have had the same reaction to meeting others with lower social development. Ignorant of the role of geographical luck and cultural good fortune, they would have found themselves believing in their own superiority. China didn't win the two-horse race because of its own cultural misfortune. It had nothing to do with genes, ethnicity, or race. In the 17th century, when they met, the West was already diverse and dynamic. China was monocultural and relatively static. How so? Geographical luck had also played a role. Rainfall on the Fertile Crescent's low hills gets agriculture going. Then the technology of irrigation is developed on the floodplain between two rivers, and you have the summer civilization in modern-day Iraq. Over centuries and millennia, agricultural civilizations rise and achieve dominance elsewhere in the Middle East. Then the Mediterranean is opened up as naval technology develops. Ancient Greece and the Roman Empire follow. The West now includes Europe. The West changed as mastery of the seas developed. Having the Mediterranean Sea right in the middle of the western lucky latitudes was another stroke of geographical luck, a place to perfect waterborne transportation, trade, and warfare. From the late 16th century, Western Europeans are crossing the Atlantic. The relatively sparsely populated compared to a crowded Europe, and socially underdeveloped Americas become part of the West. Europeans round southern Africa into the Indian Ocean. The Pacific is approached from both sides, and Europeans are the first to contemplate the Earth as a globe. Mastery of the oceans drives the first wave of globalization. Australia looks to Europeans, if not the indigenous population, as virtually empty land. Japan invites itself into the Western Club by defeating a Russian fleet in 1905. Russia itself is mostly a land power, and underpopulated Siberia gives it plenty to go at. In time, most of Africa, parts of Asia, Central and South America are colonized rather than absorbed. Transport, trade, and communications have led to the death of geography, and hence the end of any advantage or disadvantage from geographical luck. But the West, having benefited from geographical luck when it mattered, and having the dynamic and diverse culture that gave it the advantage, is now dominant across the globe. Look at the constant flux that this short summary shows, how the West's center of gravity changes dramatically over time. As what constitutes the West changes, dynamism and diversity are built in. So in 1800, what set the West apart from the rest? Many people have asked that question. In 1800, what was it exactly that set the West apart from the rest? Niall Ferguson, in his book cited bottom left in this slide, came up with the answer. It was 6 killer apps. So what were they? The first one was competition. There was something like 100 political units in Europe, plus all the joint stock companies, the corporations, the enterprises. That is set against a monolithic state in China. The diversity of political power centers meant competition, and lots of it. Compare that with the single-hand Chinese empire that was China. The second killer app, the scientific revolution. That meant the experimental method, for instance, giving us Newtonian physics, which is useful for ballistics. The scientific revolution meant the search for underlying truths through reductionism, cause and effect. Copernicus started it with his book On the Revolution of Celestial Spheres. Galileo was most famous for using the telescope for scientific observations of celestial objects. He determined that the Earth revolved around the Sun, which is called heliocentrism. That was against Catholic dogma at that time. He was tried by the Inquisition, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to recant, and sentenced to life under house arrest. But Galileo had opened the Pandora's box of science, and there was now no stopping a revolution in our knowledge. Newton was an early revolutionary, most famous for Newtonian mechanics and the law of gravity. His contribution to human knowledge was put to immediate use with artillery, and centuries later with rockets aimed at the moon. Before Galileo, Arabic science, Chinese science, and great scholars elsewhere had made groundbreaking discoveries, contributing to human progress with their insights. But the eruption of science, technology, and innovation in the West that Galileo started was on an unprecedented scale, a revolution in the production of knowledge. The third killer app, property rights and the rule of law. Property rights are a consequence of the idea of tolerance. You leave my stuff alone and I'll leave your stuff alone. They are a rejection of the might is right idea that the powerful can just take what they want. Replacing the whims of the powerful with the codified mutual restraint that is the rule of law was fundamental to the West's rise and came before the growth of democracy, we should note. Modern medicine, the opposite of a killer app. Ferguson's little joke points out that progress does not just mean knowledge and wealth, but health too. The consumer society, because then there is a point to having an industrial revolution. He notes that for industrialism to take off, you need to have a growing consumer base, a virtuous economic cycle where everyone spirals upwards. Capitalists want the workers to earn higher wages, because then those consumers are able to buy more stuff from the capitalists. And the sixth killer app, the work ethic, which, contrary to some rumours, is not a Protestant thing. For example, today, school attainment and work hours are much higher in Asia than Europe. With the rational cooperation that came after 1800 in the West, people want to work, they are rewarded for working, and so want to continue working, and so on. This obvious comment on human nature has, from time to time, been misassigned to Protestantism and a Protestant work ethic. This was never true and is easily disproved today, as the hardest workers are to be found in the not very Protestant continent of Asia. Ferguson points out that these apps are open source. That means anyone can download them. See, for example, number 6 above, the work ethic. They are not European white apps. They are human apps that the West beta tested. But he has some questions. Can you delete the apps? His thoughts on the West today? Complex institutions might collapse. History tells us this could happen. Order operating at the edge of chaos. Just because the West was the place where breakthrough progress occurred 200 years ago and is where the advanced industrial economies are today, doesn't mean that the West is fated to be where it is forever. His answer to his own question about whether those 6 killer apps can be deleted is a sobering maybe. And a question re-app 3. Can you do things in the wrong order? For instance, Africa is transitioning to democracy before property rights have been established. Or can you do without property rights altogether, as in China? China's recent rise without App 3 puts into question just how fundamental App 3 is to breakthrough progress. Some Western politicians seem to have taken note and figure they can manage without the rule of law as well. Niall Ferguson astutely points to concerns we should all have in this day and age. But returning back to 1800, by 1800 the West's culture is distinct, individualistic, meaning dynamic and diverse. As well as, or perhaps as a consequence of, being a dynamic, diverse and individualistic agricultural civilization, some people in the West before and after 1800 were having some hitherto unheard of ideas. These ideas became known collectively as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, the systematic, conscious examination of humanity. 5 words strike Tom Rich's defining the Enlightenment. Reason, for this was indeed the age of reason, and 4 other words which here at Conservatus we have taken as our human values. Those words are liberty. In the revolutions in America and France, liberty was stressed in both. The 2 most famous lines from those revolutions, life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and liberté, égalité, fraternité, in those only liberty is common. Liberty is the core human value. Progress, the belief that it is possible to consciously adapt, develop and grow. That social development can be the goal of society, and that progress, increasing knowledge, wealth and health, brings better lives for all members of society. Tolerance, mutual restraint in accepting others' rights, for example, property rights. With freedom of conscience, freedom of enterprise and freedom of choice, codified in the rule of law. And science, a belief that the universe is sufficiently intelligible for our needs, a belief in the human intellect, regardless of whether that intellect is God-given or evolved. A consequential idea from the Enlightenment is the one written by John Stuart Mill in his book on liberty. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his or her will is to prevent harm to others. That's an idea with consequences for social order, because in other words, instead of might is right, with the powerful restraining the weaker, there's something else. A social order version 2, rational cooperation, which we look at in the 4th and final lecture in the series on the human value of progress. Now, the proponents of Enlightenment ideas at the time got very excited about what they were discussing amongst themselves and what they could see of humanity's future. But for the mass of people in the West at that time, these ideas meant nothing. Many were consumed by uncertainty and fear of revolution. Slavery was not immediately affected, nor the position of women. Homosexuality remained a serious criminal offence. And when it got going, industrialization led to the impoverished lives of the working classes and indentured labour. But some people around 1800 were developing and pushing these ideas. Who were they? A word of warning: if you were to judge the Enlightenment by the mostly upper-class white men who were its proponents, then those Enlightenment ideas wouldn't warrant even a glance. Enlightenment ideas, as promoted by British gentlemen scholars, imperialist patriarchs, American revolutionaries, hypocritical slave owners, and French revolutionaries, future terrorists, because the French Revolution dissolved into the Great Terror and the guillotine. But these were ideas with consequences. Monarchies were abolished. Previously, they just replaced the old monarchy with a new one. Property rights were a big step away from tribal collectivism. Property rights move us away from tribalism by disallowing theft by mighty tribal leaders. And previously, Galileo couldn't get past church dogma. Now science has become a near-religious belief. The Enlightenment produced strong ideas that formed the age of reason: liberty, progress, tolerance, and science. The idea of progress leads to breakthrough knowledge, wealth, and health, such that 2 centuries later, extreme poverty has been nearly eradicated. Tolerance meant the West developed politically from a standard agricultural civilization to democracy, with the abolition of the slave trade, the emancipation of women, the spread of the vote to all citizens, decolonization, desegregation, and gay rights. From an inauspicious birth, Enlightenment ideas became our human values. The European West was an agricultural civilization with the same morals and ethos of all the other such entities, except it was dynamic. It was the latest in a series of geographically distinct agricultural civilizations. Big changes in power centers, both geographical and cultural, are part and parcel of the West's long history. Other agricultural civilizations were far more static. Diverse. It was a collection of competing power centers, the agricultural civilization that was the European West. The rest were far more monocultural. Europe was fragmented, with 100 or so kings and princes competing for power. Only the Roman Catholic Church provided any cultural conformity. All the other agricultural civilizations were far more monocultural. There is much more diversity in the West's experience. As an example, ancient Greece had a number of competing philosophers who are revered, whereas at the same time, roughly the same time, China had just the one, Confucius. Yet another way in which the European West was unusual is that the West was more warlike. It had the usual external threats, plus all those diverse power centers competing for territory and trade, and from the 16th century, religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. And finally, the divinity of the individual, what we might call the Judeo-Christian heritage, was unusual. It led to the Reformation, which meant printing the Bible, which led to mass literacy. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it says that God created humans in his own image. From this comes the Western religious belief that each individual person has an individual relationship with God, an individualistic view of the divine. That was unusual. The Reformation started with the publication of the 95 Theses by Martin Luther in 1517 and lasted until the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. The Reformation led to immense suffering and death during 130 years of religious war and contributed to political division, hence diversity. And refugees from these European religious wars were instrumental in setting up colonies in North America. But arguably, the most important consequence of the Reformation was the belief that everyone should read God's word themselves, which for European Christians was contained in the Bible. And so, with the help of the printing press, literacy spread. Nowhere else in the world did they have this individualistic notion that anyone, except the mighty and powerful, needed to be able to read and write. And literacy is important for industrialization. But at the same time, the West was in most ways a standard agricultural civilization. It operated under Social Order Version 1, which meant coerced cooperation, and expansion through conquest, colonialism, and slavery. The standard operating procedure for all agricultural civilizations, but with European exploration in the 17th century and 18th, now on a global scale, and with greater intensity as industrialization delivered warfighting and agricultural innovations. What started out as an advantage with state-of-the-art ocean-going or warfighting technology became a game changer with industrialization. European world domination followed. And it was a standard agricultural civilization in that it paid little or no heed to the devastation of native populations its expansion caused, albeit mostly through imported diseases like smallpox and salmonella, or take heed of the suffering of the enslaved. In these respects, the West was just like the rest. The scientific revolution led to agricultural science and botany, which allowed cotton to be transported from India to plantations in the southern US states and other plantation crops elsewhere in the Americas. Three-legged trade routes opened up across the Atlantic. European manufacturers to Africa was the first leg. African people, slaves, were transported to the Americas. That was the second leg. And third leg, American produce to Europe. Thus, the industrialized Atlantic slave trade resulted in 12.5 million Africans being transported to the New World, 10.7 million of whom survived the journey. The West was unusual in being individualistic, but as a normal agricultural civilization, it was also a carrier of tribal identitarianism. Before European exploration, beginning in the late 16th century, encounters between different races had been fleeting. Now Europeans are going everywhere, and the physical differences between different human groups is obvious. And tribal identity, or intolerance, common to all agricultural civilization the world over, kicked in. The local other is tribal. With globalization, it becomes ethnic. Different skin colors, eye and nose shapes, and other physical features become defining. It might be more accurate to say that globalization brings race consciousness, whereas locally, the other signals their membership of a different tribe by being unknown to you, or wearing different clothes, or sporting different markings, or speaking in a different dialect. Globally, you can see that the other are physically different. The West's expansion introduced humanity to racial differences. Racism is not an invention of the West, rather a consequence of the common human tribalism and Western-led globalization. When tribalism goes global, you get racism. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the fourth of 4 video presentations about the human value of progress. It is called Social Order version 2 and explores the question, what sustained breakthrough progress? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus, keep safe, intact, save from danger, our human values.